The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Eleanor Marsh would later think was a cruel kind of joke. Tuesdays being the most unremarkable day of the week. The kind of day nothing important was supposed to happen. She had been standing at the window of her aunt's kitchen in Winnipeg when Mrs. Dora Holt, who ran the postal office 3 streets over, came up the front walk with an expression that Eleanor had only ever seen on the faces of people delivering bad news. The kind of expression that apologized before the mouth opened. The letter was from a solicitor in Medicine Hat. Her uncle, Mr. Gerald Marsh, had died. Eleanor had not seen Uncle Gerald in 11 years. He was her father's elder brother, a ranching man, a quiet man, a man who sent Christmas cards every year, with nothing written inside them but his name, in the same careful block letters, year after year. Gerald, just that. As though the name itself was enough. She had always thought there was something almost dignified about that, the refusal to fill space with words that didn't mean anything. She was 24 years old. Her parents had been gone for 3 years. Her mother first, from a fever that came quickly and left nothing behind but a drawer full of embroidered handkerchiefs, and her father, 8 months later, from a grief that dressed itself up as pneumonia. Eleanor had moved into her Aunt Ruth's house in Winnipeg after that, and she had been grateful for it. Truly, but gratitude and belonging were not the same thing, and she had known for some time that she was living in someone else's life and only borrowing a corner of it. The solicitor's letter said that Gerald Marsh had left her the ranch, 40 acres of land in the foothills of Alberta, a house, a barn, 2 horses, and a modest sum of money in a Medicine Hat bank that would barely cover the cost of getting there and settling in. Her Aunt Ruth read the letter twice, and then set it down on the kitchen table and said, very carefully, "You don't have to go, Eleanor." Eleanor looked out the window at the flat gray sky over Winnipeg and thought about the Christmas cards with nothing written inside them. Gerald. Just that. "I think I do," she said. She arrived in Medicine Hat on the 3rd of October, 1889, on a train that had been delayed twice and smelled strongly of coal smoke and wet wool. The station was smaller than she had expected, and the wind off the prairie hit her the moment she stepped onto the platform, cold and direct, as though it had been waiting specifically for her. The solicitor, a Mr. Philip Abernathy, met her at the station. He was a small man with large ears and a manner that suggested he found most situations inconvenient. He shook her hand once, briefly, and then led her to his office on the main street, where he explained the terms of the inheritance in a voice that made the whole thing sound like a minor administrative nuisance. The ranch was called the Marsh Quarter. It was 43 acres, not 40, he corrected himself, consulting his papers. There was a house, structurally sound but in need of attention. There were 2 horses, a bay mare named Biscuit and an older gray gelding, whose name Mr. Abernathy did not know. There was a sum of $212 in the Medicine Hat Savings Bank, which after outstanding debts owed to a lumber merchant and a feed supplier would leave her approximately $140. "And the nearest neighbor?" Eleanor asked. Mr. Abernathy looked at her over his papers. "The Callaway operation, about 1.5 miles to the west. Thomas Callaway. He's been running cattle on the Marsh Quarter, under a grazing arrangement with your uncle for the past 4 years. He paused. "That arrangement, Miss Marsh, died with your uncle." Eleanor considered this. "So he's been grazing his cattle on land that is now mine." "He has. The arrangement was informal, a handshake matter. Your uncle trusted Mr. Callaway." "And what sort of man is Mr. Callaway?" Mr. Abernathy set down his papers. "The kind that doesn't talk much," he said, which Eleanor supposed was not quite an answer. She hired a wagon from the livery the next morning and drove herself out to the ranch because Mr. Abernathy had made it clear he did not make house calls. And the liveryman, a cheerful boy of about 17 named Dawson, had offered twice to drive her and been declined twice. The road west out of Medicine Hat ran along a creek that was already running low for the season, the banks showing raw and pale where the water had pulled back. The sky was enormous out here, in a way that was different from Winnipeg. In Winnipeg, the sky felt like a ceiling, flat and gray and close. Here it felt like something you could fall into if you tilted your head wrong. The ranch house appeared around a bend in the road, set back from a low fence line that needed mending. It was a low building, built from squared logs, with a porch along the front and 2 small windows flanking the door like eyes. It was not pretty, but it was solid, she could see that. Built by someone who was more concerned with surviving winter than with appearances. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and sat there for a moment, looking at it. This was hers. She had no idea what to do with that. She was still sitting there when she heard hooves and looked up to see a rider coming in from the west field. A man on a dark horse, moving at an easy lope that slowed to a trot and then a walk as he approached. He dismounted without hurry and looped the reins over the fence post and came through the gate, and Eleanor had a moment to observe him. Before he looked up, he was perhaps 35, maybe older, tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and still. His coat was dark canvas, worn at the elbows, and his hat had seen better decades. He walked with a slight hitch in his left leg that she would later learn was an old injury. A horse-related incident that had never set quite right, though he would never use it as an explanation for anything. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked up at her. "Miss Marsh," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at the house and then back at her, as though he was trying to work out the arithmetic of the situation and was not entirely sure the numbers added up. "I'll move my cattle off the south pasture by end of week," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Abernathy told you I was coming. Word gets around." She climbed down from the wagon without assistance, not because she was trying to make a point, but because she had always found it faster to do things herself. She straightened her coat and looked at the house again. "How bad is it inside?" Thomas Calloway was quiet for a moment. "The stove works," he said finally. "The east window doesn't latch right. Roof held up last winter, but there's a section over the back room that I wouldn't trust a second time." It was more words than she had expected from him. All at once, she got the impression he had thought about them before saying them, the way a person thinks about stepping stones before crossing a creek. "Thank you," she said, "for the honest account." He nodded again and picked up his reins and remounted in one easy motion. Then he paused, looking down at her from the saddle. "There's firewood stacked on the north side of the barn," he said. "Your uncle had it put up in August. Should last you through November if you're careful." He rode back the way he had come before she could answer. November came, and she was not careful enough with the firewood. She had overestimated her experience with wood stoves, which is to say she had almost no experience at all. And the house was colder and less efficient than she had understood, and by the middle of the month, she was burning more than she had planned and looking at the dwindling pile along the north wall of the barn, with a feeling she was not entirely the house livable. She had spent October making the house livable, the east window. She fixed herself with a length of rawhide and a determination that surprised her. The back room ceiling she could not fix, and she simply closed the door on that room and did not think about it. She cleaned and she patched, and she learned the names of the horses. Biscuit was exactly as the name suggested, gentle and round and amenable, and the gray gelding she named George, because he had a dignified, disappointed expression that reminded her of every portrait of a British monarch she had ever seen. She found work in town 5 days a week, keeping accounts for a dry goods merchant named Mr. Howard Finch, who was a decent enough employer and asked no personal questions, which she appreciated. The ride into Medicine Hat took 40 minutes on Biscuit, and she did it 6 times a week, with the equanimity of someone who has decided that complaining is a waste of breath she might need for something else. She did not see Thomas Calloway for most of October. She saw him in November, when he appeared at her fence line one morning while she was carrying water from the creek, because the pump had frozen overnight and she had not yet worked out how to fix that. He sat on his horse and watched her make 2 trips and then said, without particular expression, "Your pump lines froze." "I'm aware," she said. I said, "Wrap it in sacking," he said, "and leave a trickle running overnight when it gets below 20. She set down the water pail and looked at him. "I didn't know that." Most people who haven't done it before don't. There was no judgment in his voice. She had noticed that about him. He stated things flatly, without the editorial addition that most people couldn't resist. It was oddly restful. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He turned his horse to go, and then stopped. He looked at the woodpile, or what remained of it. "You're short on wood," he said. Eleanor straightened her back. "I'll manage." He said nothing to that. He rode away. She was mildly irritated, in the way you are irritated by something you suspect is your own fault. 2 days later, she came back from town to find a full cord of firewood stacked neatly along the north wall of her barn, cut and split, with a precision that suggested whoever had done it had been at it for some hours. There was no note. There was no indication of who had done it. Except that she already knew, and she thought about it for a long while, standing in the cold air of the barn, with the smell of fresh-cut wood around her. She didn't thank him immediately, because she wasn't sure how. She had been raised to believe that accepting help required you to explain why you had needed it, and she did not want to explain why she had needed it, because explaining would mean admitting all the things she hadn't known, and the list was long enough to be embarrassing. She thanked him 3 days later, on the road between their properties, when she met him coming the other direction. "The wood," she said simply. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "Your uncle would have done the same for mine," he said. And then he rode on. Eleanor stood there for a moment on the empty road, and she thought about her Uncle Gerald, who had sent Christmas cards with nothing written inside them, just his name. Gerald, as though the name itself was enough. She thought she was beginning to understand. December brought snow that was serious about itself, and with the snow came a series of small catastrophes that Eleanor addressed one at a time, like a woman working through a list she had not agreed to write. The gray gelding, George, went lame. She walked him out to assess it herself, and she could see it was the right foreleg, and she could see he was favoring it. But beyond that her veterinary knowledge was limited, and she knew it. She rode Biscuit over to the Calloway property for the first time, because she had not had occasion to go before. The Calloway spread was larger than hers. The Calloway spread was larger than hers. She could see that at a glance. The barn was well built, the fences in good repair, and there were cattle in the near field, dark shapes against the white, moving slowly. The house was low and plain, like hers, but with smoke, coming from 2 chimneys, which struck her as sensible. A dog met her at the gate, a large tan animal with a dignified trot, who sniffed her boot and then allowed her through, as though he had decided she was acceptable. Thomas Calloway came out of the barn before she reached it. He had been working. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the cold, and there was something on his coat she did not investigate. He looked at her with the neutral expression she had come to recognize as his version of attention. "George is lame," she said. "Right foreleg. I can see it's not the hoof." He came through the gate and got on Biscuit behind her without asking, which should have been presumptuous and somehow wasn't, and they rode back to her place, and he examined George for 10 minutes in silence. "Soft tissue," he said finally. "He's pulled something above the knee. Rest and cold packs. 3 weeks, maybe 4. 3 weeks. Eleanor said, doing the arithmetic of it. "I can lend you a horse," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at George. "I don't want to inconvenience you," she said. "You won't," he said. "I've got a spare that needs the exercise." She did not ask why he had a spare horse. She understood, dimly, that there were things about Thomas Calloway's life before this that she didn't know, and that he did not offer information the way most people did, as a way of filling silence or asking for the same in return. What he said was what he meant. What he didn't say, he had his reasons for. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Thomas," he said, and then, immediately, as though he had surprised himself, "If you'd prefer." Eleanor thought about that. "Eleanor," she said, "if you'd prefer." He looked at her then, briefly, directly, and something in his face shifted in a way that she couldn't quite name but that made her want to look away. She didn't. "I'll bring the horse tomorrow," he said. The spare horse was a steady roan named Pepper, and he was a better horse than Biscuit in all the practical ways, which Eleanor suspected Thomas knew perfectly well. She rode Pepper to town, and back 3 times a week, through December, and into the new year, and the arrangement was never discussed beyond its initial offer, which seemed to suit both of them. She began to understand Thomas Calloway the way you understand a landscape. Not all at once, not from a single vantage point, but by moving through it in different seasons and different light. He was not unfriendly. He was simply economical. He spent his words the way a man with $40 in his pocket spends money in a town where he doesn't know the prices yet, carefully, on things that mattered, with nothing left over for decoration. He was 38 years old. She learned from Mrs. Ida Beaumont, who ran the boarding house in Medicine Hat and possessed the comprehensive biographical knowledge of everyone in the district, that certain women of a certain age seemed to accumulate as naturally as weather. He had come out from Ontario 12 years ago. His wife had died in '84, in childbirth. A long bide in childbirth, along with the child. He had stayed on, because the ranch was built, and the cattle were his, and going back east would have meant going backward. And Thomas Calloway, Mrs. Beaumont said, with a certainty that suggested long observation, was not the sort of man who went backward. Eleanor took this information and held it quietly. She did not bring it up with Thomas. She thought he would find it strange, being discussed, and she thought he would be right too. What she noticed instead, in the small daily ways that matter more than biographies. He fixed her pump line properly in January while she was in town, and left no evidence he'd been there, except that the pump worked when she got home. He directed stray cattle off her east pasture twice, without being asked. He brought her a jar of rendered lard in February, with no explanation attached, and she understood it was for cooking, and did not ask where it came from. When a late-season blizzard pinned her inside for 3 days, and she ran out of lamp oil, he appeared at her door on the 4th morning with oil, and also with bread, which he must have baked himself, and which she would have thought unlikely, except that it was very good bread. "You didn't have to come out in this," she said, standing in the doorway. "Roads were passable," he said. "They weren't," she said. He looked at her. "They were to me," he said. She let him in. They sat at her kitchen table, and he drank coffee in silence, and she ate bread, and they talked very little. And it was one of the more comfortable hours she had spent in a very long while, which seemed improbable, and which she thought about for several days afterward. She was not naive. She knew what it meant, the bread and the lamp oil, and the road. That was passable to him when it wasn't to anyone else. She knew what it meant, in the way you know something before you're ready to name it. She was not sure what to do with knowing. Spring came the way Alberta spring comes, grudgingly, in increments, with several regressions that felt personal. The snow retreated from the fields in patches, and the creek rose, and the mud was a serious and committed mud that took 3 of her fence posts in March and 1 of her boot heels in early April. George had recovered. She had given Pepper back in February with a sincerity of thanks that she hoped communicated more than the words did. She had a garden to plant, and a fence to mend, and a section of roof over the back room that could not be ignored any longer, now that the spring melt was making its way through. She had her 3 days a week at Mr. Finch's dry goods store, and she had $103 left in the Medicine Hat Savings Bank, which was not nothing but was not abundance either. She was working on the fence, had been at it since morning, resetting the lost posts and stringing new wire, when Thomas rode up and dismounted, and without any preamble, picked up the wire stretcher she'd set down, and began working the next section. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. They worked in silence for an hour. It was good silence, the kind that had weight to it, that meant something. She had started to be able to tell the difference between Thomas's silences. There was his thoughtful silence, and his uncomfortable silence, and his simply busy silence. This one was the first kind. "You're staying," he said finally. It was not a question. Eleanor looked up. The field was beginning to green at the edges, new grass coming in pale and tentative. The sky was the clear, particular blue of Alberta in April, a blue that felt like a reward after winter. "I'm staying," she said. He nodded. He worked another section of wire. "The grazing arrangement," he said after a while. She waited. "Your uncle and I had talked about it being formalized. Before he got sick." He paused. "I don't want you to feel you're owed what I've been." He stopped, started again. "I'd like to pay proper lease. For the south pasture, if you'd consider it." Eleanor looked at the south pasture, which was good grass, better than his side of the fence. "That seems fair," she said. He nodded. There was another silence, longer this time, the kind where she began to understand that something else was being considered, and that the considering was costing him something. "There's a dance," he said finally. "In town, Saturday." She was quiet. "I'm not much for dancing," he added, which she believed. "Neither am I," she said, which was not entirely true. "I thought I might go anyway," he said. "If someone—" He stopped. "It's easier," he said, "with company." Eleanor set down the wire stretcher. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence post, with the focused attention of a man who was being very careful about something that had nothing to do with fence posts. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." "All right," she said. "Saturday." He glanced at her then, briefly, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. A relief so carefully contained, it was almost invisible. But it was there. She recognized it because she felt something similar herself, in a quiet place she hadn't known to look. The dance was in the hall, above the feed store, and it was loud and crowded and smelled of pine resin and boot leather and the particular warmth of too many people in a small space. Thomas stood at the edge of it with the expression of a man who had been correct about himself and his relationship to dancing, which was that it was not for him. Eleanor stood beside him and watched the room and thought she had never been so aware of the precise distance between herself and another person. They did not dance. They drank cider from tin cups, and Thomas said approximately 6 words all evening, and she said perhaps 20, and Mrs. Ida Beaumont found them in the corner and talked at them for 20 minutes, without seeming to require any response, which was a kindness. On the way home, on the road in the dark with the stars very bright and the horses moving slowly, Thomas said, "I'm sorry it wasn't." "It was fine," Eleanor said. "I'm not." He paused. "I've been told I'm difficult company." Eleanor thought about that. By who? People. What kind of people? He was quiet for a moment. People who wanted more words than I had. Eleanor considered the road ahead of them, the dark shape of it curving toward her property. She thought about the firewood and the pump line and the bread. She thought about the spare horse and the lamp oil and a blizzard road that was passable when it wasn't. "I think," she said carefully, "that there are different kinds of words." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. "That's a kind thing to say." "It's a true thing," she said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached her gate he dismounted and opened it for her, and then stood holding his horse's reins while she rode through. And she paused on the other side of the fence and looked at him. "Thomas," she said. "Eleanor." "Next Saturday," she said. "There's no dance, but if you wanted company for something that didn't involve talking much, I have a fence on the north side that needs work." She saw his expression shift, that same careful, almost invisible thing she had seen at the fence post. It was not a smile, exactly. It was quieter than a smile. "I'll bring the wire stretcher," he said. The summer was a good one, not a gentle summer. Alberta summers are not gentle, but a full one, hot and long, with enough rain at the right times to bring the pasture up high and green. Eleanor's garden came in better than she had expected. Thomas's cattle were fat by August. He came to her place most Saturdays. Sometimes there was work to do, and they did it. Sometimes there wasn't, and they found some. He was teaching her, without exactly framing it as teaching, which she appreciated. How to read the weather off the western hills. How to tell the difference between a fence that needed fixing and one that could wait. How to assess the health of a horse from 30 feet away by the way it stood. She taught him to keep accounts, because she had discovered in June that he had been doing them in his head and writing nothing down, which she found alarming in the way that practical people find preventable problems alarming. He sat at her kitchen table with the ledger and a look of polite suffering while she explained double-entry bookkeeping, and she pretended not to notice when he made a mistake and quietly corrected it in the column above, and he pretended not to notice that she noticed. She thought about it sometimes, those evenings, looking across the table at him, bent over the ledger, with his hat set aside, and the lamp making his face look almost young. She thought about the version of herself that had stood in Aunt Ruth's kitchen in Winnipeg, reading a solicitor's letter, and had thought, Gerald. Just that. As though the name itself was enough. She thought she understood now why he had sent those cards, not because he had nothing to say, but because the saying of certain things was not the point. The point was the showing up, the returning, year after year, with your name on an envelope and your presence in the world as evidence. Thomas Calloway showed up. That was the substance of him, and it was not a small thing. In September, when the slant of the light changed and the evenings came earlier, and the first geese went over heading south, he found her on the porch after supper, watching the sky. He had been helping her clear out the back room, the one she'd kept closed all winter, which had turned out to contain, among other things, her uncle's collection of seed catalogs dating back to 1871 and a very old harmonica that neither of them could play. He sat down on the porch step, below where she was sitting in the chair, and they watched the last of the light go out of the western sky together. "I have something to ask you," he said. Eleanor waited. She knew, in the way she had learned to know his silences, that this was a long time coming, and that it had cost him something to get here. Been thinking it since March, then he said. He was looking at the horizon. Maybe before that. All right, she said. I'm not. He stopped. I know I'm not easy company. I know I talk less than most people want, and I'm better at doing than saying, and I understand if that's not. He stopped again. She heard him exhale slowly. I'm doing this badly. You're doing fine, she said. He looked at her then, turned to look at her fully, and she held his gaze. Eleanor, he said, I would like. He paused. I would like to do this longer. What we're doing. She was quiet. Whatever that means for you, he said. However you want to name it. I'm not asking for. He looked away again briefly. And she saw the effort in him, the effort of a man who had spent years keeping things at a careful distance, and was now, deliberately, not doing that. I would like you to know that you have someone on your side, that is not going to change. The geese had all gone over. The sky was that deep particular blue just before dark, the last of the color bleeding out of it from the west. Eleanor looked at his profile, at the weathered angles of it, at the hat he'd set on the step beside him, because he always took his hat off when something mattered. She thought about Winnipeg, and the gray sky, and the kitchen that wasn't hers, and the train that smelled of coal smoke, and the platform at Medicine Hat, and a solicitor with large ears who had said, Thomas Calloway, he's the kind that doesn't talk much. She thought about bread baked in a blizzard. She thought about a cord of firewood and no note. She thought about a road that was passable when it wasn't. She thought about Christmas cards with nothing inside them but a name. Thomas, she said. I know. He looked at her. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting to see if you did. Something moved through his expression then, something that was not quite a smile but was kin to one, deep enough that it changed the whole shape of his face. I'm slow, he said. You're careful, she said. There's a difference. He turned back to look at the sky. After a moment, he reached up, and his hand found hers on the arm of the chair, and he held it, simply and without ceremony. The way you hold on to something that matters to you when the light is going and the night is coming, and you have everything you need right where you are. They sat there until the first stars showed, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The ranch behind them was lit from within, the lamp in the kitchen window sending its small square of light out into the dark. And it was not a quiet house, not really. It was full of the sounds of an ordinary life being built, the horses shifting in the barn, the creek moving along its banks, the last of the season's crickets making their sound in the grass. It was full. It had been full for a long time. She had just needed to stay long enough to hear it.